Welcome. This is a lecture summary about Paul and what he did. Sit back and relax. Every slide is a packed diagram. Pause the video anytime to study a chart in detail. If this teaches you something, share it with your friends and family. This is important information.
Imagine a man arriving in Jerusalem around 50 AD. He is a figure of immense privilege and intellect, fluent in Greek philosophy, Hebrew scripture, and Roman law. He carries official letters from the Jewish high court and the formidable legal shield of Roman citizenship. This man, named Paul, is about to execute a strategic maneuver that will echo through 2 millennia of human history. His objective? To seize the most incendiary concept the Roman Empire had ever confronted, the radical notion that every human possesses a divine spark, an inherent worth beyond any earthly master, a soul that no one truly owns. And he will twist this idea, this seed of liberation, into the most potent instrument of obedience the world has ever witnessed. Jesus told the enslaved that they were free. Paul, with astonishing audacity, is about to tell free people they are slaves and convince them to embrace their servitude as salvation. This is not mere speculation or conspiracy. It is the story meticulously woven into the very texts that form the bedrock of Western faith. By the end of this journey, you will comprehend the precise mechanisms by which one man reverse-engineered 3 ancient civilizations, Roman, Greek, and Jewish, into a singular institutional leviathan, the Catholic Church. You will identify the specific rhetorical sleights of hand he employed to invert the very meaning of freedom, love, and salvation. You will understand why many scholars consider Paul, not Jesus, the true architect of Christianity. And you will recognize that the system he engineered is not a relic of antiquity. It is the foundational operating system still silently running beneath the surface of modern power. To grasp the magnitude of Paul's work, we must first understand the crisis he was, in essence, hired to resolve. The Roman Empire was not merely supported by slavery, it was built on it. Slavery was the engine of its economy, the bedrock of its social order. The vast majority of people within the empire were either enslaved or teetering on the edge of destitution. The immense wealth, the lavish lifestyles, and the political power of the Roman ruling class, the patricians, senators, and provincial governors, all rested precariously on a foundation of human property. Then a figure emerged from the margins, Jesus of Nazareth. His message was deceptively simple, yet utterly devastating to the Roman status quo. There is something divine within you. You are not property. You belong to no earthly master. There is a power higher than Rome itself, and it resides in your own heart. The impact was immediate and explosive. Slaves, hearing this message, began to shed their fear of death. They started questioning authority, defying their masters, and crucially, walking away from their forced labor. In the cold, hard economic terms of Rome, this was not just spiritual awakening, it was outright theft. Every slave who ceased to work, every servant who challenged their owner, was actively dismantling the empire's wealth. When Jesus was crucified, the Romans deliberately placed him between 2 common thieves. The symbolism was not accidental. In their eyes, he was the greatest thief of all, systematically stealing their most valuable asset, their labor force. But crucifying Jesus did not solve the problem, it exacerbated it. His teachings, delivered in short, memorable, poetic verses, spread even faster after his death. People whispered his words to each other, and those words ignited a spark. The idea of inner divinity was loose, spreading like wildfire across the empire. Rome desperately needed a solution, but not a military one. You cannot kill an idea with a sword. They needed someone who could capture that dangerous energy, that revolutionary fire, and channel it. Someone who could transform a burgeoning revolution into a controllable religion. They found Paul.
Here is a profound truth often overlooked in conventional histories. In the decades immediately following Jesus' crucifixion, there was no singular, unified Christianity. Instead, a vibrant tapestry of diverse Christianities flourished. Dozens of distinct communities, each interpreting Jesus' teachings through their own lens, sprang up across the Roman world. Many of these early assemblies were remarkably progressive, often led by women, charismatic, wealthy, and fiercely independent. These communities were characterized by their democratic spirit, their rich diversity, and their profound spiritual freedom, embodying the very essence of Jesus' core teaching. The divine spark resides within each individual. No intermediary stands between you and God. The undisputed leader of this original movement was James the Just, Jesus' own brother. Operating from Jerusalem, James steadfastly maintained the movement within its Jewish traditional roots, serving as the ultimate living authority on Jesus' true meaning. Paul, however, harbored a fundamental disagreement with James. Reports constantly reach James. Paul is out there, claiming Jesus is God, asserting that belief in Jesus is the sole path to salvation, and dismissing the necessity of circumcision. James, who had grown up alongside Jesus, shared meals with him, and knew the man intimately, would respond with simple clarity, "Of course he's not God, he's my brother." Paul eventually confronted James in Jerusalem, and according to biblical accounts, a temporary agreement was reached. Yet one must ask, who stood to gain most from James's eventual death? As long as James lived, Paul could never fully dominate the narrative. He could not position himself as the definitive voice of Christianity while Jesus' own brother breathed and, crucially, contradicted him. James was murdered, and with his passing, the last living check on Paul's burgeoning authority vanished. It is widely known that early Christians faced intense persecution. This historical truth is undeniable. However, a crucial detail often omitted from standard accounts is the identity of many of these persecutors. A significant number of early followers of Jesus were not persecuted by the Roman Empire. They were persecuted by Paul himself. His particular brand of Christianity, a rigid, hierarchical, and obedient orthodoxy, was, in those initial decades, a distinct minority. The vast majority of Jesus' adherents preferred the original teachings, an emphasis on personal freedom, the indwelling divine, and spiritual independence. These were the very principles that empowered individuals and threatened established power. Paul, with relentless determination, systematically crushed these independent communities one by one. His campaign was not against those who rejected Jesus, but against those who rejected Paul's interpretation of Jesus. He sought to standardize belief, to centralize authority, and to eliminate any deviation from his prescribed doctrine. This internal persecution was a strategic necessity for Paul. To build the unified institutional church he envisioned, he first had to dismantle the diverse, decentralized movements that preceded it. He understood that control over the narrative, over what constituted true belief, was paramount. Any community that preached a different path, a different Jesus, was an obstacle to his grand design. Thus, the very man often credited with spreading Christianity was also responsible for suppressing its earliest, most diverse, and arguably most authentic expressions.
Paul of Tarsus continues to present scholars with three profound questions, none of which have been satisfactorily answered by conventional narratives. First, why would a man of such immense privilege, a wealthy, highly educated Hellenized Jew, possessing both status and influence, abandon everything to align himself with a marginalized movement of illiterate Jewish peasants? This defies typical motivations. Second, Paul was initially a fanatical Pharisee, zealously hunting down and persecuting Christians. What truly transpired on the road to Damascus, this supposed flash of light that transformed him into Christianity's most passionate advocate? Was it a genuine spiritual conversion, or something else entirely? And third, perhaps most revealing, consider the logistics. Paul spent decades traversing the vast Roman Empire, establishing churches, employing a retinue of secretaries, and funding extensive missionary operations. Where did the money for such an expansive and long-term enterprise originate? Apply even basic analytical thinking to these three questions, and a compelling picture begins to emerge. Paul exhibits the classic profile of an agent, someone strategically deployed by a powerful sponsor to achieve a specific objective. The simplest answer is that he worked for Rome. His Roman citizenship, which saved his life on multiple occasions, provided undeniable protection. When attacked by a mob in Jerusalem, it was Roman soldiers who intervened to rescue him. When facing judgment, he invoked his citizen's right to appeal directly to the emperor, securing safe passage to Rome. Indeed, the book of Acts, which chronicles his story, often reads like Roman propaganda, portraying Jews as an irrational mob, while Rome is consistently depicted as the rational, protective authority. But there's an even more intriguing possibility. Paul may have been a double agent.
By ostensibly spreading Christianity, he was simultaneously disseminating the Jewish Bible, the Torah, the prophets, and the powerful idea of Jews as God's chosen people, elevating Jewish scripture to sacred status across the entire Gentile world. A Jewish spy subverting Rome from within would, from an external perspective, look indistinguishably like a Roman spy subverting Judaism from within. The very beauty of espionage lies in this indistinguishability. However, the most likely truth, the most compelling explanation, is simpler and more ambitious. Paul was working for Paul. He recognized an unprecedented opportunity to construct something entirely new, a religious empire designed to outlast any political one. As the old joke goes, God and Satan are having an argument. God declares, "The humans have found religion, I win." Satan replies, "Don't worry, I'll organize it." That, precisely, is what Paul did. Jesus discovered the fire. Paul built the furnace. Paul's true genius lay in his unparalleled capacity for synthesis. He did not conjure a religion from nothingness, nor did he simply transmit Jesus' original teachings unaltered. Instead, he meticulously observed the three dominant cultural and ideological forces of the Mediterranean world: the profound spiritual heritage of Judaism, the sophisticated philosophical and ritualistic traditions of Greece, and the pragmatic, hierarchical social structures of Rome. With the skill of a master artisan, he welded these disparate elements into a single, cohesive system. This new construct was designed with a dual purpose. It offered something familiar and appealing to everyone, ensuring broad appeal and rapid adoption, while simultaneously serving the entrenched interests of power. Paul understood that for a new religion to thrive and endure, it could not simply replace existing beliefs. It had to incorporate and transform them, making the transition seamless and compelling. He recognized that people are more likely to accept a new framework if it resonates with elements they already understand and value. By selectively drawing from each civilization, he created a hybrid system that felt both revolutionary and deeply familiar, a spiritual language that could be understood across diverse populations. This strategic integration allowed Christianity to bridge cultural divides and expand at an astonishing rate, laying the groundwork for its eventual dominance. It was a testament to his profound understanding of human psychology, power dynamics, and cultural engineering. From the rich tapestry of Jewish tradition, Paul extracted the powerful concept of eschatology, the fervent expectation of a Messiah. Jewish belief held that a warrior king, divinely anointed, would one day rise to shatter Roman oppression and re-establish the glorious kingdom of David. This was, unequivocally, a profoundly dangerous idea for the Roman Empire, a constant threat of rebellion and liberation. Paul, with a stroke of rhetorical genius, performed a masterstroke. He retained the potent symbol of the Messiah, but radically altered his mission. Jesus, Paul declared, was not a Messiah of earthly war or political insurrection. He was the Messiah of peace, whose ultimate purpose was not to overthrow Rome, but to die for humanity's sins, offering spiritual redemption. In this single audacious move, Paul took the most militant, revolutionary strand of Jewish belief, the very idea that promised freedom from imperial tyranny, and transformed it into a doctrine of profound submission. The Messiah's kingdom was no longer a terrestrial reality to be fought for, but a spiritual promise to be awaited, achievable only through faith and passive obedience. This reinterpretation effectively defanged the revolutionary potential of Jesus' message, channeling its energy away from political action and towards internal spiritual transformation. The danger to Rome was neutralized. The potential for Jewish rebellion, inherent in the messianic hope, was skillfully diverted into a path of quiet devotion.
From the vibrant and often secretive world of Greek culture, Paul borrowed the compelling framework of the mystery cults. These were secretive, ritualistic communities centered around the worship of various deities, such as Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and spiritual liberation. The parallels between these ancient cults and the nascent Christian rituals are not merely striking, they are, by scholarly consensus, not coincidental. Consider the core narrative of Dionysus. He was born of a virgin mother, Semele, his divine father being Zeus. He was tragically killed by his enemies, only to be resurrected by his father. His devoted followers participated in a sacred ritual meal, during which they believed they consumed the very body of the god,
absorbing his divine energy and achieving a profound communion with the divine. Paul adopted this template almost wholesale, recognizing its powerful psychological and communal efficacy. The virgin birth, the sacrificial death, the miraculous resurrection, these foundational elements were seamlessly integrated into the Christian narrative. And the ritual meal? In Christianity, it became the Eucharist, or Holy Communion. Bread transformed into the literal flesh of Christ, wine into his sacred blood, consumed by the congregation in an act of profound spiritual absorption. The mystery cults, therefore, provided Paul with a ready-made ritual technology, a powerful, visceral mechanism for fostering collective identity, spiritual transcendence, and a deep emotional connection to the divine. This was not merely spiritual symbolism, it was a deeply immersive and psychologically potent practice designed to bind adherents together and to their new faith.